Hello, classical rhetoric students. This is your Professor Paulette Stevenson with our first week wrap up. So, welcome to the course. I'm glad that you've all found your way around and have gotten a feel for what happens. One note, in the wrap up videos, I like to talk about the highlights of discussion and go over some of that with you all, some big points. Our first one isn't going to be as long as the rest because the introductions don't cause as much clarification from me. So that's something to note. But the thing that I want to just touch on real quick is if I mispronounce your name or I misgender you, I apologize. Please send me an email and let me know. That's the nature of our online class, is that I see, number one, as much as I try, I'm not amazing at pronunciation. But number two, that I don't have an interaction with you to tell me who you like to be called, or even if you like to be called something. So that's another point, is to sign your posts. I know there's at least one person in class who said Blackboard has me listed as this person, but I go by this name, and they're not. They're very different. So if you sign your posts, you'll ensure that I'm more likely to call you by the name that you prefer. Yeah. So let's go over the class, the discussion this week. First of all, I think most of you all, not everyone, but most of you all have a background in education, are educators yourself, or are hoping to become educators at higher ed or sort of high school. So that's awesome. It's nice to be in a room of like minded people. I've been teaching at Arizona State University for almost 10 years. So that was, most of you all said something like that. And so and some of you come from a lot of different backgrounds. Your bachelors, not everyone has English bachelors, which is awesome. Not everyone is super familiar with classical rhetoric. I think some of you have a little bit more familiarity, but I think most of us have a basic understanding, and maybe it's just within degree programs or interests, classical rhetoric just kind of never popped up, and so you didn't take those courses. So I'm glad that you're here. And like I said in the introduction video, is I'm not expecting you to be a classical rhetoric savant at this point. This is definitely an introductory course, and the materials. That's the other point I want to make, is the first week's materials. If we consider this our first real week, they're pretty light. So there's the background, the context in Basel and Hertzberg, and there's the kind of recontextualizing that context in the Walker. But then the next week we get into some heavy philosophical stuff. And so I want to prepare you for that reading, to definitely take your time for that. So, some points of discussion. Most of you all, commented on each other's personal stuff, like, oh, I'm doing that too, or maybe, you live or have lived in similar areas. So that's awesome. It's nice in an online class to connect with people, and by more than just the subject matter. Definitions of rhetoric. Some of you all, the most common one is the art of persuasion, and it has to do with persuasion. So like Mary or Kelly touched on, her working definition is communication that is designed to persuade, written or verbal, but graphics such as signs. So that's something interesting. There are definitely some points that obviously people in ancient times, our thinkers, just couldn't even anticipate that we were going to be communicating on the internet. So they're definitely more concerned with oral, mostly oral for a while, and then it gets into written speech, but delivered speeches in law courts and assemblies, but then also at funerals and at these epidectic occasions, which is something Walker gets into. So that's something that you might think of in going through this class is how to modernize some of this or think about some of this in modern terms or theorize about our own contemporary rhetorical situation and the more visual nature of all of this, and where do our classical theories come into play. I think one of the things that the Walker piece gives us is that Bazell and Hertzberg really focus on the rhetorical tradition is forensic and judicial. But then Walker kind of points out this, like evidenced by the title before the beginnings, points out this epidectic tradition that exists well before the the um, the democratic norms come into play, the law court or the civic participation in law courts and assemblies. So we have this oral tradition that comes from poetics, that has more to do with emotion than logos, that kind of structures our rhetorical tradition or predates it in ways that Bazell and Hertzberg don't always recognize. So that's one of the themes you'll recognize in this course is that in as much as we have I definitely give you the more classical version of the story here. There are also alternate narratives, and Bazell and Hertzberg give a really solid context and foundation, but they're not the only one. If you're struggling to grasp the foundational one, and there are weeks that will have optional readings and you're having a hard time, like, you're fine to not grab those optional readings, but they're definitely interesting to get a different viewpoint. So more definitions of rhetoric. We have Conrad, who talked about Kennedy's definition as speaking to most of the things that he talks about, including current context, public language in general, rather than limit rhetoric to public speaking. So I think that's, we're catching on that strand. Shayla talks about the different forms of communication. Let's see. Also, Ariel discusses the persuasion, but like kind of categorized persuasion to accept an idea, opinion, of facts, or a set of beliefs. So I think that's interesting too, like kind of categorizing this. Is rhetoric persuades, but here's the categories of persuasion. And she kind of gives a lot of really interesting examples. And then, so one more. So, Brandy talks about rhetoric, about effective communication. And kind of, I don't know if she's completely going there, but she says everyone is an expert in every field now. One of the things that we'll get to towards the end of the semester is that for sure rhetoric is that like a scientist, for example, needs to know there's certain scientific field. A chemist needs to know about chemistry. But how can rhetoric help a chemist out? Newsflash, this is a classical rhetoric class. It definitely can. And that's one of the things that I think some of our authors get into is rhetoric its own field? Like, is it its own field of study, or is it part of all these other things, if that makes sense? So anyway, those are some highlights from the discussion. Again, if there's something that I mispronounced your name, please send me an email, or I got something wrong on that, send me an email and let me know. Hallway conversations, the first 2 days of class, I didn't have it set up to notify me when there was participation on there, so I didn't get those first 2 days of class. So I apologize, but after that, it sends me an email anytime you all post on there, so I'm pretty aware of when you post on there. A couple more things. The Walker piece, if you didn't get to it, I know most of you all focused on the introduction points and the Bazell and Hertzberg, but the Walker piece is really interesting. I'd like to think that the Walker piece definitely structures some of the first couple readings. So the Sophist and Isocrates, he gives a lot of really good background for contextualizing what they're doing. I know that most people, when they think of rhetoric, normally think more like Aristotle, and most of you would be, I wouldn't say surprised to know, but Aristotle comes at the middle of the semester. So there's a lot that comes before him, and there's a I wouldn't say it's quite different, but the rhetorical tradition before him and Plato is a little bit different in their aim. And I think that the Walker piece kind of introduces you to that a little bit more. So if you're more familiar with Aristotle, the Walker piece will help you with kind of introducing the background and the context of the Sophists and Isocrates. Anyway, so I'm rambling, so I'm going to wrap up, but thank you for a great first week. I'm looking forward to your participation next week. Have a great week.